Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to the Meiji Guillotine Murders by Fūtarō Yamada, translated by Bryan Karetnyk. Eyes and Legs. Chapter 4. Was Kazuki's decision to release Heikurō Kagawa, the man who had kidnapped the geisha Kikuchiyo, the right thing to do in the end? The incident weighed on Kawaji's mind so much that he refused to let the man out of his sight. When he looked into it, he found that the man's work record was not very impressive. On the occasions when he did turn up at the office, he would attend to his duties obediently enough. But there were also times when he failed to show up entirely. The reason for these frequent absences was apparently that he drank too much. Whenever he did, he would become violent and drink himself into oblivion, and then the very next day he would find himself in such a sorry state that he couldn't move. There was certainly a touch of the alcoholic about him. One evening, a few days later, Kawaji spotted him ducking into an izakaya on his way home from work, and so that the chief inspector wouldn't be noticed, took a corner seat and availed himself of the opportunity to observe his descent into inebriation. When Kagawa was in a blind stupor, Kawaji heard him quietly lament, "Oh, what a coward I am! A real coward! I hid between the walls while my own father was being murdered. When they were torturing my father, I heard my 11-year-old brother, Ben Nojo, throw himself before them, screaming and wailing that if they were going to kill father, then they would have to kill him as well. In the end, I was just too afraid to show myself. I may have survived, but really, I died back then. Now I'm just an empty shell of a human being." First, Kawaji had been convinced that it was Kagawa's state of mind that had led to the kidnapping. And now he thought that it was because of his weak nature that he had let his own father die. He would have only been 18 or so at the time, but he was still the son of a retainer. For a young man from Satsuma, it was unconscionable. An experience like that, moreover, would ruin his life forever. Apropos of Kagawa Sr.'s murder, apropos, a preposition with regard to something. Apropos of Kagawa Sr.'s murder, there were some things that had been preying on Kazuki's mind after the incident at the Sazeido. "What I don't understand," he said to Kawaji, "is why would Lord Iwakura want to have a curse laid on his late majesty? I'm sure that was just a rumor. But where were the grounds for it then? I have no idea. I gathered that the late emperor wasn't really in favor of overthrowing the shogunate. There was talk of uniting the shogunate with the imperial court, of having them coexist, each with its own separate responsibilities. That's why Lord Iwakura, who wanted to see imperial rule restored absolutely, was unhappy. Maybe his dissatisfaction was misinterpreted. So, effectively, in order to re-establish the emperor system, they had no choice but to overthrow an emperor who wasn't so keen on it, mused Kazuki. I'm not sure I'd put it in quite those terms. You once told me that Lord Iwakura was one of the most terrifying men you knew. Now, hold on a minute, Kawaji hastily replied. I may have said that, but I never said anything about him laying a curse on the late emperor. But Kazuki, as was his wont, fixed him with a look of comprehension. Well, Lord Iwakura isn't the only man who'd stop at nothing to achieve his goal, Kawaji said. People are strange, are they not? Kazuki laughed feebly. Later on, Kawaji too would come to the disconcerting realization that Lord Iwakura was capable of anything. To review the facts, Kawaji, one day, quite by chance, had witnessed Deputy Under-Secretary Maki of the Ministry of Popular Affairs in the company of two kabuki actors at Ginko Kishida's house in the Tsukiji foreign settlement. Suspicious of the group, he had Maki investigated and found that he owed large sums of money to several money lenders. He had subsequently discovered that the moneylender Kinpei Kobayashi was keeping a former geisha as his mistress. Finally, he had learned that Kobayashi's mistress, Okino, was an old friend of the geisha Kikuchiyo, who was the sister of an assassin, and because of this had been the target of an aborted kidnapping by the son of her brother's victim. It was all very tenuous. What was more, the only reason that Kawaji knew any of this was that he had learnt it from Sergeant Saruki, or else had just so happened to be in the right place at the right time. And besides, as an officer of the law who knew better than the average man how full of sorrows the world is, not one of these circumstances seemed especially out of the ordinary. In fact, you could even say that they were commonplace. And yet, these circumstances were not unrelated. They were strands of a single affair, one that was steadily marching towards catastrophe. It was only 10 days after the incident at the Sase-do that Kawaji received word informing him that the geisha Kikuchiyo had gone missing. On the previous day, at around 5 o'clock, she and 3 fellow geisha were summoned by the Okeya in Saruwaka-cho to a certain restaurant in Matsuyama-cho. They traveled there by rickshaw and cut through the precinct of the Sensoji Temple in Asakusa along the way. As they were passing through, Kikuchiyo, whose rickshaw was last in their procession, suddenly asked the driver to stop for a moment, telling him that she wanted to pay her respects. The driver watched her trot off towards the main temple, but she never returned. Not that evening, nor even the following day. On the evening that Kawaji received this report from Sergeant Saruki, he was understandably shocked. Saruki had come running after visiting Kobayashi's pawn shop again and hearing the story from Okino. The two then set out immediately for Saruwaka-cho. They questioned the other geisha as well as the rickshaw puller, but the only answers they got were that nothing had been out of the ordinary that day, and that when Kikuchiyo had disappeared at the temple, she hadn't seemed to be carrying any money or belongings. The two men could only assume that Kikuchiyo had been kidnapped again. Their thoughts turned naturally to Kagawa, and so they ran straight to Yanagihara. As expected, they found him drinking in a local izakaya. It was no after-work drink either. He had skipped work that day and gone drinking instead. When Kawaji inquired, he replied that he had been drinking there all the previous evening as well. "Why do you ask?" He said. He was pretty drunk by then, but now he seemed to sober up a little, and his expression grew anxious. It was impossible to tell, however, whether this was genuine or he was playing dumb. When they asked the proprietors of the izakaya, they replied that Kagawa had indeed been sitting there from 4 o'clock till 11 the day before. This seemed plausible enough, so Kagawa had an alibi. Faced thus with a dead end, Kawaji and Saruki could not help looking disappointed. 3 days later, however, a horrifying incident occurred. In Shiba, Homamatsu-cho, there was a house that belonged to Shuzo Toba, a junior secretary in the Ministry of Popular Affairs. It was early morning on the 20th day of the 9th lunar month, and in front of the house stood a rickshaw with a long white object propped up inside it. It had been found by one of the servants, who discovered it to be a human leg that had been severed just above the knee at one end and just above the ankle at the other. Needless to say, the discovery caused quite a stir. When they received the report, both Kawaji and Kazuki rushed to the scene. Since the limb was missing a foot, it was not immediately clear whether it was the right or left leg, but the distribution of the flesh on the calf suggested that it was the left. It was still fresh, probably having been severed only the night before, and you could tell at a single glance that it had been cut off with a sharp blade. The blood had been washed off, and this pillar of white flesh was so plump and hairless that everybody agreed it could only have belonged to a woman. The Toba family was at a loss to explain any of it. It transpired that the rickshaw had been stolen from a company in neighboring Tsukiji. Kawaji's suspicions fell on two familiar figures, however. He believed that the leg was Kikuchiyo's, while the perpetrator must have been Kagawa. Once again he rushed to Yanagihara, and yet it emerged that the previous day Kagawa had in fact gone to work at the Grand Council of State, and that after leaving he had headed straight to his usual drinking den, where, as was his wont, he became blind drunk, so drunk in fact that he lay down in a corner of the izakaya and didn't stagger home until 8 o'clock the next morning. No matter who Kawaji asked, be it Kagawa, the couple who ran the izakaya, or even the regulars who were there on the night in question, there could be no doubt about it. Kawaji was astounded. And yet, once again, the very next day, Kawaji received an urgent report from Sergeant Saruki. after questioning Kagawa, whose alibi was supposedly watertight, had apparently absconded. The bare-faced liar! Kawaji was upset at having let opportunity slip through his fingers once again, but after consulting with Kazuki, he summoned the usual 5 Razotsu and ordered a Tokyo-wide search for Kagawa. He then added, "Oh, yes, that's right. There's also the matter of Kikuchiyo. Where is the woman? After having her leg cut off like that, I doubt she's still alive. So keep an eye out for the body of a woman missing one leg." As Kazuki silently watched the Razotsu clatter out like a pack of bloodhounds, albeit not especially brave ones, he did not look reassured. "But doesn't Kagawa have an alibi?" he asked, in a manner of speaking. "But something here isn't quite right, and when I get my hands on him, I intend to find out what that is," Kawaji grumbled. Maybe he didn't do it himself. He could have got somebody else to do it for him. After all, who but for Kagawa would want to do such a thing? And besides, isn't his sudden disappearance the best proof of it? I know his father had his arms cut off, but then why would the victim have her leg cut off? To make it easier for her to hunt people when she's a ghost? Don't be silly. Besides, her arms might have been cut off as well. We can't be sure until we see the body, said Kawaji. Not only was the leg cut off above the knee, but the ankle was cut off as well. What do you make of that? Heinous though it was, this guy's father had both his arms and his head cut off. So never mind limbs. It stands to reason that he might want to chop his victim, bit by bit, into little pieces. It isn't something any sane person would do. In his mind, Kawaji just couldn't get rid of the image of Kagawa's face with its manic quality that appeared especially when he had been drinking. 3, then 4 days went by. But still, Kagawa was nowhere to be found. Kikuchiyo's body had not been discovered either. But then, on the 5th day, Kagawa showed up as a corpse, drowned in the river, just upstream of the Ryogoku Bridge on the bank of the Honjo's Yokoami-cho. There was a spot called Hyapongui, where hundreds of stakes had been driven into the riverbed to protect the bank at a bend in the river. It was a good place to catch carp and other fish, and so early that morning a fisherman had gone there only to find the body floating in the water, caught among the stakes and carried there by the cold autumn winds. There were no injuries to the body, nor were there any signs of strangulation. Over the course of 5 days, however, Kagawa had grown so emaciated, with a scraggy beard now covering his hollow cheeks, that he almost looked like a different man. With nowhere else to turn, he must have taken his own life, said Kawaji, staring down at the corpse blankly. But Kazuki, now we'll never know what happened to the murdered woman. Chapter 5. These events were shocking. A single leg found in a rickshaw, and now the man thought to have done it found drowned. Yet, in a sense, it was what occurred 2 days later that dealt an even greater blow to Kawaji. Or, to be more precise, what came afterwards. At around 10 o'clock on the morning of the 27th day of the 9th lunar month, Kawaji was at the Imperial Prosecuting Office listening to a report from Sergeant Saruki on the failed search for the woman's body. Just Then, however, another report arrived from the Ministry of Popular Affairs in Marunoichi, informing him that a short while ago, Junior Secretary Shuzo Toba had committed seppuku in his office. Shizu Toba? I'm sure I've heard that name somewhere before. Kazuki, who also happened to be there, cast a quizzical look at him. Of course! Kawaji cried out. He's the owner of the house where the leg in the rickshaw was found. Kazuki, too, recalled the long, dark, but rather willful-looking face of Shuzo Toba, who, at the time of the incident, had said that he had no idea what it was all about and that it must have been a coincidence. Dropping everything, the three of them rushed over to the Ministry of Popular Affairs. When they arrived at the office, they found a dozen people standing around in a circle, frozen like statues. There, in the middle of the room, lying on the floor and surrounded by a sea of blood, was Shuzo Toba. What happened? Kawaji asked. He killed himself because of the murder he committed, a rather corpulent man replied. Corpulent, having a large, bulky body. Obese, corpulent. Chubby, synonyms include chubby, fat, fleshy, full, plump and pudgy, overweight. Corpulent. He killed himself because of the murder he committed, a rather corpulent man replied. Not only did this answer come as a surprise, but when Kazuki and Kawaji turned to look at the man who gave it, they were startled. Though they had never met in person until now, they recognized him as Tateki Maki, the man they had spotted through the binoculars. Maki was an undersecretary at the ministry, which meant that he had been Toba's superior. But whom did he kill? Why, Hikomaru Kagawa, of course, replied Maki. And what makes you say that? Asked Kawaji in astonishment. According to the testimony of Undersecretary Maki and the other officials who were present, the events of that morning were as follows. Shuzo Toba was a capable employee of the ministry who outshone many of his colleagues and was, moreover, a very upstanding man. A year ago, however, he had apparently fallen in love with a geisha, a certain Kikuchiyo from Surawaka-cho. It had all started when Maki invited Toba, who was not only from the same province, but from the same village in Chōshū, to a restaurant and called for Kikuchiyo as well. The very upstanding Toba fell hopelessly for her and, after that night, began following her around. The man had an obsessive and brooding nature. Eventually, Toba became visibly worried when he learned that Kikuchiyo had a brother in the old capital, a Shishi, who had killed a man. And because of that, she had been targeted and very nearly kidnapped by the son of her brother's victim, a minor official by the name of Hikomaru Kagawa. About a week ago, Kikuchiyo vanished, and Toba felt certain that she had been kidnapped. Then, after the discovery of the severed limb outside his house and Kagawa's disappearance, Toba's frenzy peaked. He believed that Kagawa had somehow discovered his infatuation with Kikuchiyo and had done this to spite him. Toba searched for Kagawa like a man possessed, and then 3 days ago he found him at night on the bank of the Sumida River. He interrogated him. A fight ensued, and in the end Toba pushed Kagawa into the river. At the time, Kagawa was so drunk that he could hardly walk, so it was only natural that he drowned. When Maki heard about Kagawa's death, he had a hunch that it was all down to Toba, but of course, he had no evidence of this. This morning, I called Toba in my office and asked him outright whether he was responsible for Kagawa's death, Maki explained. He blanched at the very mention of it, but then he played dumb and claimed not to know anything about it. Anticipating Toba's denial, however, Maki had already made certain preparations. One being that he had already summoned several officials connected with Toba. You say you know nothing about it, but there's no real proof of that, Maki had said. So, permit me to show you something, and we'll see whether that changes your answer. Gentlemen, please keep a close eye on Toba's reaction. Then, right on cue, the door at the back of the room had opened to reveal a figure. Upon seeing this, Toba had cried out, "Eh!" His eyes wide and his mouth agape. You're alive!" was all he could say. He had frozen stiff, like a dead man. Standing before him was none other than the geisha, Kikuchiyo. And she isn't just alive. Look, she has both legs, said Maki. Kikuchiyo, if you would do the honors. There, in front of the assembled men, Kikuchiyo blushed but seemed quite prepared to carry out Maki's order. Timidly, she raised the hem of her kimono, revealing two perfectly white, perfectly attached legs. But this can't be! This cannot be! Toba cried. What, then, was that in the rickshaw? It must have been somebody else's leg, said Maki. He now turned to the representatives of the Imperial Prosecuting Office. I was surprised myself, to be honest. I'd heard about the leg that was found outside Toba's house and was convinced that it had to be Kikuchiyo's. Imagine my surprise then when she turned up at my house last night, full of life and with both legs intact. When I asked her what had happened, she told me that she'd run off to a friend's house in Shimosa. Ah, what a mess Toba had made of things. Though he wasn't the one who called for Kikuchiyo and the other geisha on the night of her disappearance, he had a few days previously insisted that she go to a hideout that he'd prepared for her. After her experience of being kidnapped, the very notion troubled her. But Toba was so worried for her safety that, being the kind-hearted person he was, he couldn't stand by and do nothing. For her part, however, Kikuchiyo disliked the importunate Toba even more than she did the man who had tried to kidnap her. How fickle the heart can be! So, with all these thoughts racing about her head, Kikuchiyo finally had enough and, on a whim that day, decided to run away from Asakusa to Shimosa. Then, just last night, completely unaware of all the mayhem that had ensued, she decided once again on a whim to go and see an old friend of hers who is now the mistress of a pawnbroker in Yagenbori. There Kikuchiyo heard at last about everything that happened since her disappearance, including Kagawa's body being found in the river. She was so shocked by this that she and her friend came to ask me what they ought to do. You can imagine my surprise when I saw her. Kawaji was stunned and for a few moments didn't know what to say. Why did the pawnbroker's mistress accompany her? Asked Kazuki. We know each other a little, said Maki, thinking that this wasn't a good enough explanation. However, he added, I was one of her patrons when she used to be a geisha. He was determined to keep a poker face and not let on that he had borrowed money at a very high rate of interest from the pawnbroker. It's obvious that Toba made a mistake, but mistake or not, this didn't change my opinion that he had surely killed Kagawa. And if this came to light, it would cause a scandal. As an official of the Ministry of Popular Affairs, and as Toba's superior, I couldn't possibly turn a blind eye to this. So, I decided to make Toba confess by having the living Kikuchiyo paraded before his very eyes so that everybody could watch his reaction. Faced with Kikuchiyo alive and in one piece, Toba had looked as though he were in the middle of a nightmare. But I saw her leg being cut off, he had cried out. It was a curious remark, to be sure. What nonsense is this? When? The day before her leg turned up outside my house. Where did you see it? From the tower of the Tsukiji Hotel. Maki had looked aghast as Toba stood there, gasping for air. Maki-san, I saw it through the binoculars you gave me. You told me to go to the Tsukiji Hotel and take a look at Tokyo. You gave them to me yourself, didn't you? I really did see it. Chapter 6. Kawaji gulped as he listened to the tale. He was right enough about that, Maki continued. Just the other day, the pawnbroker's mistress, Okinu's, her name, was telling me about an interesting item that had come into the shop. It was a pair of binoculars, which he lent me. Hold on a minute, said Kazuki. Did she say anything about the person who'd pawned these binoculars? Indeed, she did. Even in this age of opening up to the world, I said to her, who on earth pawned something as rare as these? And she said, at this point, Maki shifted his gaze, that it was a razotsu. Saruki's eyes darted about. He looked at Kazuki and then at Kawaji, then started cradling his head in his hands. As a regular at the same pawn shop, Saruki was no stranger to Maki. Indeed, that was how Saruki had come to hear of Maki's debts in the first place. Taken aback, Kawaji glared at Saruki, who appeared to be attempting to bury his head in the sand. So, in the end, it was Saruki who had stolen the binoculars while he stood guard at Kazuki's house. Was nothing beneath this man? Very well. We'll return to this subject later, said Kazuki briskly. Now, tell me, what happened after that? Well, said Maki, Okino suggested that I take a look at Tokyo from the bell tower of the Tsukiji Hotel. So I took the binoculars and headed there. I was so impressed that before returning them, I lent them to Toba with the same recommendation. He must have gone the day before the murder. According to him, while he was looking out of the tower, he witnessed the woman's leg being cut off through the window of a Western-style building. Apparently, she was lying on top of what looked like a bed. There was blood everywhere. They were cutting her flesh with a dagger and sawing right through the bone. Who was? Asked Kawaji. There was a curtain in the window half blocking the view, so all he could see was the woman's legs and the hands pinning her down and holding the dagger and the saw. So there was more than one other person? It would certainly seem that way. And the woman's face, was it really Kikuchiyo's? As I say, he could only see her legs. But then, how did he know it was a woman? Oh, there was no doubt about it. Or at least that's what Toba seemed to think. Ah, yes, there was a young boy there in the tower as well. He could have been only 10 or so and asked Toba to let him see for himself. Seemingly, Toba obliged. Or no, that's it. He said it was the boy who saw it first. Kawaji and Kazuki exchanged a look. So, leaving the boy behind, Toba ran out of the hotel and tried to find the building he'd just seen through the binoculars. Only when he found it, all the windows were covered in cobwebs, and there was only an old caretaker there who told him it was unoccupied and sent him away with a flea in his ear, saying not to be so ridiculous. Toba said he returned home then, in a daze, wondering whether it hadn't all been a dream. At that point, it hadn't even occurred to him that the girl might have been Kikuchiyo. But the very next day, when the leg turned up right outside his house, it was as though the scales had fallen from his eyes. He immediately thought it must have been hers, but he was wrong. "If you don't believe me, then ask the boy," he said. "Go to the hotel and you'll be able to find out who he is." "There's no need. We already have that information," Kazuki interrupted. Maki gave him a strange look. "But what about Toba's suicide?" asked Kawaji. Even if Toba was mistaken about Kikuchiyo, there can be no uncertainty that he was the one who killed Kagawa. He said that he looked into Kagawa's movements on the day, and since he had not showed up for work, Toba inferred that it was proof of Kagawa's scheme and decided that he had no choice but to kill him discreetly. It looks as though Toba had been planning to feign ignorance over Kagawa's murder, but the shock of seeing Kikuchiyo alive betrayed his resolve. Toba could sense this from the way everybody was looking at him. All of a sudden, while we were still asking questions, he committed seppuku. The other officials nodded. Even a person of high rank cannot get away with murder. Toba was from the same village as I, and he came from a prominent family. Rather than face the shame of imprisonment, he died by his own hand, and I believe this was for the best. My colleagues and I humbly beg that you keep this affair as quiet as possible." "Saruki!" said Kawaji. "Yes, sir!" "Go and fetch the boy. You know the one I mean." "He said he lived in Koishikawa, in the Takasaki domain's residence," Kazuki added. "I think his name was Kanzo Ichimura. Take a rickshaw and bring him here." Having escaped questioning over the binoculars for the time being, Saruki rushed out, looking rather pleased with himself. Kazuki bid the whole group be seated, before seeming to lose himself in a silent contemplation. The renowned chief inspector looked so solemn as he stood there that none of the officials dared to sit, and instead they just stood around, trying not to look at the bloody corpse of their colleague lying on the floor. It was about an hour later that Saruki returned with the boy. When the young lad saw Kazuki, he flashed a smile of recognition, but his expression turned serious as soon as the questions began.
"I did see it," the boy declared. "I really did see the lady's leg being cut off."
"But that as it may, what were you doing up in the tower again?" asked Kawaji.
"That morning, on my way to learn my English lesson, a lady stopped me and told me that if I went to the hotel at 3 o'clock, she'd let me look through the binoculars again. I really wanted to have another go with them, so after the lesson was finished, I rushed straight there."
"A lady? What lady?"
"She was wearing an Okoso Zukin headscarf. So I didn't really get a proper look."
The two chief inspectors looked at each other.
I feel as though I've got various links in the chain, but I still can't piece them together," muttered Kazuki. "Who could this woman in the headscarf be? She offered to let the boy use them again, so she must have known not only that Toba was going to be there that day, but also that we'd been there before. But who could have known that? Esmeralda would never have done a thing like that. And besides, if it was her, the boy would have noticed her blue eyes."
"More to the point," said Kawaji, "if there really was a woman who had her leg cut off, then who is she? There's something distinctly odd about that house in the foreign settlement. I'll have to talk to Kishida again. Then again, there's something that seems distinctly queer about him too." 2 days later, Kawaji arrived with an update for Kazuki. "There's not much to report, although I did find Kishida at Dr. Hepburn's house. He says he's no idea what's been going on at his house in the foreign settlement, because he hasn't been there lately. So, the day when Toba said he saw a woman's leg being cut off through the window was the 19th, right? Well, that day, or more properly, from the 15th until around the 25th, Dr. Hepburn was suffering from a bout of rheumatism. Evidently, even famous doctors can get it. Anyway, it was getting worse, so Kishida was run ragged, having to look after him and send away all the patients that had come to see him. Now that the doctor can just about stand the pain, he's back at work, but they're having to work through all the patients that have accumulated, and they're exhausted." Kishida just said, "Spare me the unnecessary questions," and slammed the door in my face. Kawaji was indignant. And there I was, thinking I'd hit it off with the man. As for whose leg it might be, or why this series of incidents has occurred, your guess is as good as mine. Chapter 7. On the last night of the 9th lunar month, the inhabitants of the foreign settlement were startled when they looked up and saw the windows of the Tsukiji Hotel bell tower stained a bright crimson. They realized at once that it was not a fire, but still they could not quite dispel the strange, rather eerie feeling that had come over them. 2 braziers were burning in the tower, but of course they were being watched over lest the fire spread. On a plain wooden dais were displayed various props used for ancient rituals, and sitting in a long row were the usual grandees of the Imperial Prosecuting Office. Old Manabe and his daughter, Kazuki, Kawaji, and the 5 Razotsu. Also present in this spacious room was the pawnbroker's mistress, Okinu, the geisha Kikuchiyo, as well as a delegation of a dozen or so officials from the Ministry of Popular Affairs, including Tateki Maki. The Kagura bells suddenly rang out, cling cling, and the Miko Esmeralda's voice began to chant. Awariya asobi hasutomo, mo sanu asakurani, shuzo toba no mitama, ma iritamae. This, of course, was the second time that this otherworldly ceremony had been held in the Tsukiji Hotel, though the first time it had been in the great hall below. Ima, Mairu, I am the spirit of Shuzo Toba. Kikuchiyo let out a faint, muffled cry. Whee! For the first time since arriving in the land of the dead, I can see the land of the living without a hindrance. I truly believe that Hikomaru Kagawa had murdered Kikuchiyo. And little wonder, Kagawa had borne a grudge against Kikuchiyo for some time and had even attempted to kidnap her. Then, after she disappeared, I witnessed the leg being cut off, and that leg was delivered to my house. The enormous windows on all four sides of the room had been flung open to the vast autumn night sky with its countless twinkling stars. None of the assembled guests were looking at them, however. It was as though everybody were floating in another dimension altogether. Some of this was true to begin with, but some had been contrived afterwards. Kikuchiyo disappeared because somebody encouraged her to do so. I was deceived. Like a fool, I was ignorant of the degree of loathing that Kikuchiyo felt for me. Kikuchiyo put her hands over her ears in horror. The scene in the house in the foreign settlement was Dr. Hepburn amputating the leg of the Onagata Tanosuke Sawamura. Kawaji winced as though he had felt the lash of a whip. Sawamura is suffering from a disease called gangrene, which causes the leg to rot from the foot. The only way to cure it was to have the leg cut off. Only Dr. Hepburn could perform the operation, so Sawamura requested it through Ginko Kishida. The otherworldly strains of the Kagura music continued to ring out. Tong, cling, cling. Moreover, Sawamura did not want this to become a public knowledge and feared that he would become a spectacle if he went to the Hepburn residence in Yokohama. So, he asked for the operation to be performed in secret at Kishida's house in the Tsukiji foreign settlement. Although Dr. Hepburn ordinarily never sees patients outside of his house, he agreed to this request. The disease was not visible to the naked eye, but it had spread, so they had no choice but to amputate the leg above the knee. What I saw was this operation being carried out with the help of an assistant. The reason Kishida did not mention it to the chief inspector afterwards was out of sympathy for the beautiful actor's vanity, and because Sawamura himself had asked him to tell no one. But how could I, after having seen such a thing, have ever imagined that? In fact, my witnessing of it was an artful affair.
It was of course the boy who saw the incident and showed me, but he had noticed it only because he was fascinated by the building in the first place. What the child had originally witnessed was the preparations being made for Sawamura's operation. When the binoculars came into the hands of another person, Sergeant Saruki told them what the boy had seen. The real culprit took advantage of this and used the child to make sure that I saw what was going on in the same building a few days later.
Did I really say that? Muttered Saruki nervously, momentarily putting down his flute. Nobody other than Kawaji and Kazuki heard him, however.
Indeed, the woman in the headscarf who enticed the child to go to the Tsukiji Hotel again that day was none other than the pawnbroker's mistress, Okinu. But she herself had been threatened by the real culprit and forced to play a part.
Okinu shuddered. Her head slumped forward as though her neck were about to break.
It was also the real culprit who had given Kagawa the scrap of paper in the izakaya, enticing him to abduct her. The trap had been carefully laid. While the operation was taking place, the culprit was hiding in the next room, and when the opportunity presented itself, the amputated leg was stolen. With such meticulous planning, it was no wonder that when the leg turned up in the rickshaw, I believed it belonged to Kikuchiyo. The reason the foot had been cut off was to hide the evidence of gangrene. Then, Sawamura's beautiful feminine leg was shaved so that it would look like the genuine article. I, however, believed it was all Kagawa's doing and flew into a rage, finally killing him. Seeing it all clearly now, it was always the culprit's aim to take advantage of my obsessive nature. Perhaps it was to be expected that the criminal would hatch a plan like this. We came from the same village, and although my family enjoyed higher status, he had worked his way up and feared that I would drag him down again one day. Then my chance came. I got wind that he was mad for the theater and Onagata, and that he was up to his neck in debt from moneylenders. For a government official, that was scandalous enough. But if it were ever to become public knowledge, he could say goodbye to it all. And he knew that I knew this. So he turned me into a murderer and pushed me to kill an innocent man. Kagawa was innocent. When he learnt of Kikuchiyo's disappearance, he knew the Imperial Prosecuting Office would suspect him. So he made the rash decision to run away, believing he had no other option. The Kagura bell suddenly rang out. Cling, cling. I fell right into the criminal's trap. Worse yet, I was placed in the unavoidable position of having to cut my own stomach before the Imperial Prosecuting Office could question me. The golden-haired Miko's voice had already begun to fade away when the dull thud of the Kaendaiko resounded. Dong, dong. Needless to say, the culprit is...
The voice trailed off, and Esmeralda's head slumped forward.